Hi class, welcome to Module 7. As we address the items of Chapter 6, how does gender impact the people you spend time with? I think you guys can all answer this when you start thinking about it. So who was your first friend? For me, beyond my sister, who I'm only learning to be friends with now, 40 some years, 50 years later, and my cousins, it was the boy next door, Michael Thoman. And I wonder what happened to him. He grew to an age where it wasn't cool to have the girl next door as his best friend, and then moved away. Our parents stayed friends, and later we moved not far from him, and I walked home from high school every day, walking right by his house, and I saw very little of him. That friendship makes a difference. As a child playing together, gender doesn't come into place. In fact, do we even realize what our gender is? When I teach sociology of childhood and we talk about when did you first explore and know that you were male or female, the sexual piece of it, and then understanding your gender within that. This is important to consider how we form partnerships, how family is there, the social influences. This chapter is excellent at bringing that. As you explore this chapter, you think sociologically about the influences in your own life that determined who are your family and who are your friends. You know, family is much more today, especially when we look at it sociological, than just those that are legally your family. So we're going to look at a number of things. I'm going to flip over to the PowerPoints and we'll discuss them very briefly as we move forward with this module. If you notice, I haven't put the SLOs up for the last 2 weeks. I think the first slide often hits on exactly what the student learning outcomes are. But to understand the networks of friends and kins that come together and how they're tied to gender. One of our other student learning outcomes here is to understand the significance of relationships outside those of nuclear families and to be able to define what friendships, choices, and obligations exist. Now, sociology doesn't always do a good job at looking at friendship. In fact, when I prepped this summer for this course, I went to see if there was more research on friendship than there's been in the past, and there is. But it's very limited on how we look at friendship. Friendships evolved based on sentimentality and sociability. And we have this strong emotional attachment that comes along to certain friends, and we like to spend time with them. Friendship is a much more equal status relationship than any other that we have in our life. There isn't that hierarchy of power that comes into place. So who's better at being friends? Now, remember, limited research. Psychologically, they look at friendship a lot more than sociology has because they're looking at those nuances that occur within friendship and how we build things. When we look at the language of gender, we know that men and women build friendships a little differently, and there is a whole issue at looking at language and how we interact. Hopefully, we'll get to the video on Deborah Tannen and looking at some of her research, but we only get limited clips within the YouTube setting. Anglo-European society emphasized that friendship involves intimacy, trust, caring, and nurturing. And women identify as better friends. As far as relationships, they tend to have more friends than men. We see a number of things that come into place. It's interesting, as I was preparing for my notes on this topic, I was also preparing for my class, my intro class. And in that, we were talking about culture. And I showed them a quick TED Talk which covered some things on culture. And in his talk, he spoke of what a Norwegian defined as a friend. And to that person, their description of the best friend was someone you could be in the same room with and be comfortable without saying a word. Friendships based on our culture vary significantly. If they vary by culture, we can clearly see how they can vary by our gender and how we get into close relationships with each other. The discouragement of men in expressing emotions is pretty sociological. We can see that societal influence. And when we have this masculinity that discourages that emotional intimacy, then developing relationships at that deeper level can be more difficult within the process. So who's being a better friend within that historical perspective? Men were viewed as the model of friendship, that manly love, that men were more public and important, and that relationships were based on bravery and trust and heroism, where women were considered unable to commit. That it was a very different process as we started to look at the development of those gender differences. So face-to-face, the degrees of conversations, the emotional sharing that takes place between women today now place women in that more confident type of relationship. They're able to share those feelings, and where men tend to be more of that side-by-side. And again, when we look at conversationally, we can see that actually occurs at very young ages, the interaction between differences between men and women. It's interesting that we expect them to be the same, and yet they are significantly different. And part of that may be biology, part of it may be social influence, and part of that may be psychological. All of these things come into place to reflect on those differences. So when we look at this, when we study this, we see the psychoanalytical theorist, Rubin. She looks at those relationships. Girls emulate their mother's behavior. Boys create, it's separate from their mother. They create these strong ego boundaries. And we see this definition. Rubin found men associated male friendships with homosexuality in our era today. So very different than that historical pattern. Remember, when we talked about when we start defining homosexuality in the 18th and 19th century, in the 19th and 20th century, then we change where male friendship lies within the process. Even when we go back on some of those historical dramas, we know the strong relationships that men can have, but those are over created by our context that we're sitting in and how much that has changed. So the difference as far as social networks out there is that institutional explanation of gender differences exist as we start to look at those. We look at that socialization, segregation, that there's a realm of social life into different groups, and it's based on some of those categories. In fact, we kind of force these groups, and men and women develop into different types of friendships, and even same men and women as groups in friendships is often questioned whether they can truly be friends. That gender is a key significant structural component in how we view friendship and how we form them with our number and qualities. Now, there's some interesting constraints that come into place as we look at environments, and you need to weigh this very carefully as you're reading this data. that the author is putting forward, and along with the theories that men have larger networks because of their workplace increased networks. Now think about that. Is that reality today? Because there are more women in the workforce today than men. But women have this network now coming into place, but they in the past relied more on kinship networks. They are also the keepers of the kin. Women tend to keep that kinship relationship together and watch over it at a closer level. So we're seeing the similarities become more today because both men and women are in the paid workforce and have the similar friendships with that. Gender differences disappear in long-lasting relationships. So those long-term relationships that you've kept with friends since you were little, that gender difference isn't there. Men and women value trust and authenticity most in their relationship. And what we see is that the elderly display friendship very similarly based on their gender, no matter what, that maybe some of those sexual tensions are dropped out of the picture at those younger ages that begin your friendship, or even at the older ages when you begin them, that there's a different perspectives. Now, Walker, when he examined the global and actual experiences of friends, found that men and women form substantial friendships differently, and that the gender ideology sometimes contradicts with the actual experiences, that men engaged in non-gender behaviors such as sharing intimacies, while women reported not sharing intimacies with friends. I think it's interesting. Listen to conversation. Now, some of your assignments for this course have you do things like that. But my husband and I owned a gas station for a long period for 4 years. And men are often thought of, as they build these relationships, not sharing the intimacy that occurs. But what I found in studying the conversations at the time was, it's amazing what men talk about over a car engine. It's not just the repair of the engine, but there's a lot of intimacy about details and moving forward that comes into place. So there is that exchange that often isn't thought to be there in a different manner. It's interesting, as a woman working in that gas station, that I was treated more like that man when I was working on their car in that same relationship. And we see the change in society. Women's participation in sports and activities becomes into place. Now, the conclusion here is that social class affects gender differences in everything. So that then affects the differences in our friendships, that there are so many other pieces that come in place besides gender. Let's look quickly at families here too, as we look at this, that the relationship is family of choice, and this is this fictive kin network that become our family in the process. Then we put them and we allow to bring families together and create our own families to meet that needs. Now, attraction, significant difference as far as what comes into place as we look at love between men and women and how things come together. The current research is saying that men are more committed to finding a relationship than women, as we start looking at the changing society and where it fits and what they are looking at. We have the world of hookup or hooking up today, where college students have no time or date but have the sexual desire. And it's interesting as we see this friends with benefits type relationship that comes into place. Current research is showing that we're actually delaying sexual encounter more now than even 10 and 20 years ago for teenagers, that there is this group dating and this group courtship and the change of courtship that comes into place. Some pretty significant issues as we start to explore these gender differences are also tied to then the differences of society in general. The hookup, the sexual encounters usually only last one night. They're between two people who were strangers or brief acquaintances. And even that does not seem to give us a clear guideline of which prefers this type of relationship as we start exploring. I think as we look at the gender of love, and it's important to think of the social influences here of what defines what we should be like in a love relationship. Researchers suggest masculine and feminine styles of romantic love, that instrumental love, is more common among men. Husbands and take their wives to be car to be serviced as an act of love. They do a household task or do the dishes as an act of love, where women are much more about affectionate love and sitting down, sharing their day and talking with their spouse. That there is that difference. Now think about it. Does it always work that way? No. But we're looking at the majority of the population when we're interviewing. Part of this is also dictated by the society that we're living in, that it's a significant influence that determines what is the best way to express love in our society. Should we be vulnerable? Should we cry? Are we still at that boys don't cry over their pain? We don't show love in the same manner of follow-up. So we see this as part of the exploration of this topic. Now, other researchers will argue it. They don't recognize men instrumental love. They see that separate, and they see that our social lives are highly dependent, so that gender differences within the process can be formed. But those gender differences are the rearrangement of the organization of our social lives, that someone becomes more important. Now, the finalness of this chapter sums up that all cultures have the basic idea of love and intimacy. We know that all cultures have some form of a marriage type arrangementship to create this love, to hold people together, and that we feel affection and strong affection in place. Now, going back to our earlier chapters, it's not always sexual, is it? And so this piece of friendship looks at love and sharing in a very different level, that we have this ability to make inner relationships, and they are affected by gender. But the clear effect is not always there. So what are you going to do for the week? I've moved this back to our module, and you can see you actually have a few videos to watch. In fact, there are 5 under 20 minutes on each one on attraction, dating, and social network. These are all TED Talks on the weird science of love. And let me pop over and show you some really neat titles here of what is going on that you'll be looking at, and they'll talk about the gendered issues. So within these 5 talks, you're going to see the brain in love, just the idea of the biology, the mathematics of love. Can we work it out on how we can find the right person to love, and the tips. This one on Amy Webb on how she hacked online dating and how she was able to look at the system. I think this one on pheromones, I was watching it again yesterday. Just this idea that this biological piece comes into place that determines who we love and who we're attracted to. And finally, again, Helen Fisher, and I believe that you see her from The Brain in Love. She is an anthropologist, and she talks about this biochemical foundation of social importance of why we love and why we cheat and what's the different for gender issues. I think you'll find these fun compared to some of the other videos. I want you to think back within the process of what has been going on in the course as you move forward with your discussion this week. So your discussion this week, nice and simple, thinking about yourself, thinking about who you spend time with, reflecting on the information from the videos. They help you understand gender better? What did you find interesting and what did you disagree with within the process? Because there's so much research yet to be done on this topic. You can easily see how it would be able to be disagreed with on many points. And then your gender exercises for the week is choose from 2, 4, or 5 this week as you move forward. Hope you have a great week. Thank you.